When Mark moved to Ashford, he noticed the flood before he noticed almost anything else about the town. Not an actual flood, because the streets were dry. The river ran quietly behind the park and nothing about the place looked especially damaged. He noticed it in conversations. People mentioned it, the way they mentioned the old cinema or the yearly market, as something everyone already knew about. The woman at the bakery said her parents had lost their first shop in the flood. The man who repaired Mark's boiler told him the neighborhood had never felt the same after the water came through. Even children seemed to know about it. On his second week in town, Mark passed the schoolyard and heard a boy say, "My granddad says the flood reached the church steps." And nobody explained it. Nobody needed to. In Ashford, the flood was part of the furniture of memory. At first, Mark assumed he had simply missed the obvious. Every town had its stories, and disasters often left marks that outsiders didn't recognize. He expected to find a plague somewhere, or an old photograph in the library, or perhaps a memorial near the river. But the more he looked, the stranger it became. The town's website listed its history in great detail. The old mill, the railway station, the factory closure, the fire that destroyed the theater in 1976, but the flood was not mentioned. Local newspapers' archives went back more than 100 years. Yet the year everyone kept referring to contained nothing but council reports, wedding announcements, and a long-running argument about parking near the high street. Mark even checked weather records, expecting at least a storm, but the summer in question had apparently been unusually dry. The contradiction began to bother him in a way he found difficult to explain. It wasn't simply that people remembered something wrongly. People misremembered things all the time. What unsettled him was the consistency. Everyone described the same event with the same quiet certainty. The flood had happened in August. The river had risen during the night. Water had moved down Mill Road, crossed the square and stopped at the church steps. 3 families had supposedly lost their homes. An elderly man named Robert Vale had become something of a local hero after rescuing 2 children from a ground floor flat. These details appeared again and again in conversations with people who had never met one another. Mark had been a history teacher before he moved to Ashford, which made his curiosity feel almost professional. He began spending evenings in the library, reading old newspapers and council minutes. The librarian, Mrs. Keane, watched him for several days before asking what he was looking for. When he told her, she didn't laugh. She only became very still. Then she said, "You're looking in the wrong place." She led him to a locked cabinet in a small room behind the reference section and removed a cardboard eye-carve box tied with faded string. Inside were letters, handwritten accounts, photocopied photographs, and pages of testimony collected over decades, and every document referred to the flood. Mark sat there until closing time reading through the papers. The witness statements were detailed and ordinary in a way that made him difficult to dismiss. People described the smell of river mud in their kitchens, the sound of furniture scraping across floors as water lifted it, the cups of tea handed out in the church hall the next morning. There were lists of damaged properties and a hand-drawn map showing how far the water had spread. One photograph showed several residents standing outside the church, their trousers dark with moisture, faces tired and unsmiling. On the back, someone had written "Morning after the flood, 18th of August." The photograph should have settled the matter, but it didn't. Mark compared it with newspaper copies from the same week. The front page on 18th of August carried a story about a flower show. The next day's edition reported a minor burglary and a cricket match. A flood that damaged half the town would not have been ignored. Insurance records showed no major claims. Council minutes showed no emergency repairs. The church hall had hosted a charity lunch that week according to its own ledger, with no mention of evacuees or damage. It was as though the flood had happened everywhere except in the official world. Over the next month, Mark spoke to all the residents whenever he could. None of them liked being questioned too directly. They would describe the flood freely in casual conversations, but the moment he asked why it wasn't recorded, their confidence changed. Some became defensive, others looked embarrassed, as if he had pointed out something impolite. Mrs. Vale, the granddaughter of the man credited with rescuing the children, showed him a medal kept in a velvet box. It had been given to her grandfather by the town, she said, although the engraving on the back had worn almost smooth. Mark could still make out the date though, 18th of August. Nothing else remained clear. The deeper he went, the more Ashford seemed to divide into two versions of itself. In one version, preserved in archives and official documents, the flood had never occurred. In the other, preserved in memory, letters and family stories, it was the defining event of the town's modern history. Mark began to feel less like a researcher and more like someone standing between two maps that almost matched. The streets were the same, the names were the same, but one showed a river where the other showed dry land. The first genuine break came from a school register. In a folder of old educational records, Mark found a note explaining that classes had been suspended for 3 days after 18th of August due to community disruption. The phrase was vague enough to mean almost anything, but it was the first official document that seemed to bend toward the memory of the flood. He brought it to Mrs. Keene, expecting interest. Instead, she looked sad. "There used to be more," she said. "What do you mean?" She unlocked a second drawer and showed him a photocopy of an index card. The original, she explained, had disappeared years earlier. So had several council files, 2 reels of microfilm and the church maintenance records from that month. Documents connected to the flood had a habit of becoming misplaced, damaged or reclassified. Not all at once, slowly, over time. Records forget more easily than people, she said. Mark didn't answer, because the sentence sounded too prepared, as though it had been passed down like the stories themselves. A week later, Mrs. Keene called him to the library before opening hours. She had found something in a box that hadn't been catalogued. It was a cassette tape from the 1980s, labeled only with a name, Robert Vale. They played it on an old machine in the archive room. The voice that emerged was thin and crackling, but clear enough. Robert Vale spoke about the flood in a calm and practical tone. He described waking to shouting in the street, seeing water at the bottom of the stairs and carrying a child through a window because the front door would not open. Then the interviewer asked him why the flood wasn't in the papers. For several seconds, the tape hissed in silence. When Vale answered, his voice had changed. "It was in the papers," he said. "I saw them. Everyone saw them." And then one day they weren't there anymore. Mark felt the skin on his arms prickle. The interviewer asked who had removed them. And Vale gave a strange little laugh. "You're asking the wrong question. Ask why we still remember." The tape ended shortly afterwards. That night, Mark walked through Ashford in the rain. It was not heavy rain, only the soft, persistent kind that made pavement shine under streetlights. He followed Mill Road toward the square and then continued to the church. At the steps, he stopped. The river was several streets away and lower than the town. By ordinary logic, it could not have reached this far without leaving catastrophic damage. Yet as Mark stood there, he noticed a faint line running across the stone wall beside the church gate. It was easy to miss, a slight difference in color about waist height. He touched it with his fingertips. It felt like any other stone. The next morning he checked photographs of the church before the alleged flood, and the line had not been there. By then, Mark no longer believed he was solving a local legend. He was documenting a contradiction. Something had happened in Ashford, or something had failed to happen everywhere else. The distinction began to feel less important than it should have. The people remembered water. The documents remembered dry weather. Neither side seemed entirely false. Before leaving the archive that afternoon, Mark asked Mrs. Keene why the town kept the box locked away instead of displaying it openly. She considered the question for a long time. Because people outside Ashford don't like the story, she said. They either laugh at it or they try to explain it away. After a while, you stop offering memories to people who only want evidence. Years later, Mark would publish an article about collective memory in small communities. He never mentioned Ashford by name. He wrote about oral history, gaps in archives, and the fragile relationship between memory and record. It was a respectable piece, careful and academic. It made no extraordinary claims. But he kept copies of the photograph, the school note, and the transcript of Robert Vale's interview in folder at home. Sometimes he took them out and arranged them on his desk, trying once again to make the two histories fit together. They never did. The last page in the folder was a map of Ashford. Mark had drawn the flood line himself, based on every account he could find. It crossed Mill Road, widened through the square, and stopped at the church steps, exactly where everyone said it had stopped. In the corner he had written the question that still bothered him most. The question was no longer whether the flood had happened. It was whether someone had tried to make it look as though it never had, and if so, why?